Every forest has a story. Our history as a world and mankind is written in the tree rings that exist in these forests, and they document the ever-changing, shifting ecosystem and culture that surrounds them. The cultures that have existed with it, that forest embodies everything about what has happened around it, and it creates all of the actions, the behaviors, and the lifestyles of the people living around that forest. When we start to look at the forest environment and the ecosystem, it's one of the most important and necessary things that we coexist and collaborate with in the modern world. We see the change of the forest as a record of the growth of civilization in the built environment. And it's important that we don't underestimate how significant the forest ecosystem is in influencing our culture, our impression of nature, and the individual that interacts with these spaces. When we start to look at that embodiment of character that the forest provides for people living around them and the ecosystem that they create, those iconic concepts of that forest really start to dictate and explain a lot about who we are. When I started my career in bonsai, the composition of a forest was the farthest thing from my mind. I wasn't interested in the forest form. I wasn't necessarily inspired by the forest environment. Over the course of my bonsai career, however, there have been a lot of different experiences that have contributed to my appreciation of the forests across the world, and in particular the native forests of the United States. I started to recognize how important this ecosystem was, not only to observe and to learn from, but also as a marker for what's happened historically and where we're headed in the future. Designing a bonsai forest has that same significant impact and necessity to convey and communicate that forest power and its influence on us as individuals. And through the vehicle of bonsai, miniaturizing that impact is still equally as significant and potentially even more capable of communicating and dialoguing about culture as it exists, where it's been, and where it's headed. In 2012, I was at a real turning point in my career in bonsai. I was grappling with this identity crisis of having studied in Japan, been the lead apprentice to the most famous bonsai master in the world, Masahiko Kimura, trying to understand where does the approach of Japanese bonsai play a role in the creation of bonsai in a different culture that is either European or American. How does cultural influence shift the way that we approach the art form? What are the shapes of the trees and the species and the environments that we need to adapt to do bonsai well? And what does that look like for me as an individual, but also for bonsai as a culture? I was driving trees to the national show from Portland, Oregon to Rochester, New York, and I was crossing this massive continent of North America. And one of the things that really struck me and stuck out as I was driving through the different parts of the country was how different not only the cultures were in terms of clothing, food, activities, but also how different the people were, influenced by that environment of that ecosystem, the natural elements, the contours of land and the forests that existed there. And I started thinking, man, these forests are really starting to form and change the way that we engage with our world and the way that we engage with each other. And each of these places has this unique forest that defines this place and really starts to create sort of that system of society. And it was powerful. It was really powerful to see all of that coming together, driving across the country, and see that diversity, and also to see the diversity of the forest and of the shape of the land, and recognize I can't, in pursuing bonsai honestly, if bonsai is a reflection of nature and miniature, and bonsai is a relationship and a presentation of the individual and their interpretation of their relationship with that environment, I can't continue to wonder what it would be like to do bonsai in a Japanese way, or what it means to do bonsai in a Japanese way. Because to do bonsai, to take advantage of recreating nature in miniature and using that abstraction of my thought to represent those wild places in this miniaturized form, I had to start to dig into those forms as they exist for me, in my immediate environment, in the culture that I exist in, as a result of the influence those forests are having. And after being in Rochester and seeing this congregation of the bonsai community in North America, I recognized how misunderstood our relationship with the environment was, and how diverse and misunderstood my understanding of North America was. And it started this quest as I was driving back from Rochester, recognizing to use bonsai to start to iconically represent the culture in which it's created means digging into what is that form of the forest, what represents and defines those environments across North America. It created a project for me and a major ambitious goal to create a forest that represents every specific ecosystem in North America. Now, when I started thinking about where am I going to begin with this, my mind immediately went to the tallest tree in the world and something that is very uniquely and iconically American, the redwoods. I started wondering, how am I going to create this redwood forest? The scale of this forest is going to be gigantic. What is it going to look like? How am I going to find the materials to do so? What is this composition going to become that's going to sort of catalyze this movement towards attempting to redefine my bonsai approach and really explore those natural forms that represent the cultures of North America? I had grand ideas and I had assumptions about the form of the redwoods, but I wouldn't actually understand the redwoods unless I went down and experienced them for myself. Upon arriving in Portland, Oregon, I set a plan to drive down to the redwoods at the end of 2012 and really immerse myself in that environment to better know what it was I was trying to create. I drove down and spent 3 days in the redwoods, walked through several of the old growth groves, enjoyed the coastal influence, acknowledged the impact of the fog, and recognized that redwoods are this universal, collaborative community of trees that create the environment, the understory, the weather. That redwoods really do hold with them the notion of this unlimited freedom, this vast expansive opportunity of the West, and started to understand the depth to which these trees had created the mentality that had built California and the ideas of the Western United States on the backs of their grandeur. Now, before I could start to really explore this movement away from the Japanese model, whether it be in a single trunk form or now more significantly the forest form, I really had to go back to what are the nuts and bolts of forest creation? How do we create a good forest? Even in the traditional form, these concepts play into and feed the execution when we miniaturize this massive ecosystem into this digestible, smaller environment that we're representing either in the container or some other body that holds this forest. And I started to go back to the concepts that Mr. Kimura used to consistently preach as he was creating the diversity of forests that really coined and sort of iconicized his bonsai work. Number one, forests have different heights than the trees. This is a very paramount concept of forests. Number two, the trunks have different thicknesses. There are ages to the trees in a forest. There are generations to a forest. A forest is a living, breathing community that has several iterations and reproduction and generations and old and dead and new and living and intermediate. And we see this plethora of forms in these sizes and heights. To give this concept of natural, there's different spacing between the trees. This is point number three, and it's extremely important that we create this diversity of spacing to show the randomness that is nature and the way that these forests grow and evolve. Number four, we use different planes. In bonsai, we know the composition is dictated by foreground, middle ground, and background, and in a forest, it's no different. The use of these planes creates the depth and that immensity that a forest is able to convey when we're standing in the middle of it and we see those trees in the far distance and we see those trees in the foreground and we see that diversity of depths that that forest takes on to really grow that experience of that composition. We start to look at a forest and recognize that the elements that play on that forest are very similar for that ecosystem, and we see a continuity inside of that forest. Now, it doesn't mean that every tree has the same shape, but it does mean that the elements that are playing on that ecosystem has an impact that is thematic, that is continuous throughout the composition or through that forest, and that we carry those tones and those different features of those environmental components and the land itself throughout every tree that we place into this composition. The last component that I really needed to key into and pay respect to was the idea that a forest, in a miniaturized form, is a composition one unto itself. And that means that that composition, in order to hold the interest of the viewer and really possess that quality visual that we know and come to value in bonsai of asymmetry, had to be interpreted and conveyed through the forest creation, so that we do have flow to the composition. We do see the direction and the movement and the existence of these trees as one cohesive unit in a miniaturized form, to work together to create the totality of a singular composition. These concepts guide our process. In the traditional form, we have a pattern and a repetition to the placement of trees. We see the tallest, biggest tree placed 1/3 in the container. We see another tree next to it, and we see a smaller tree as the initial 3 trees of the composition that really dictate and create the backbone for the rest of the forest to be built around it. We may see another subset of trees with a medium girth tree and another 2 or 3 trees around it to create a secondary grove. We see the smaller trees in the foreground to present the smaller trees and give us that concept of size and differentiation. We see the small trees in the back to give us the appearance of the disappearing forest as it shrinks in the distance. These are very fundamental concepts that guide that fundamental traditional forest creation, but they don't have to all be followed if we're truly creating a forest that is representative of a specific region, of a specific environment, and of a specific culture. And this is where we start to see the forests of Mirai following some of these traditional concepts of forest creation as they create a beautiful singular, one unified component composition. But we also see deviations from these different points, so that we're able to further communicate and better convey the environmental factors and the impact of the land, the impact of time, and the impact of perspective on what it means and what it feels like to view these compositions and be able to understand where we are in the North American continent. When you walk through the redwoods, you're talking about these trees that are 250 foot plus of vertical height, and the limitation to understanding the redwoods as a miniaturized form in the bonsai manner is difficult, because when you stand at the base of the redwoods, you can only see this massive rigid line heading straight towards the sky. How do the branches look? How do the apexes form on redwoods? If you could zoom out, what would the organization of that forest be? And this is one of the biggest challenges to creating this redwood forest that really embodies the spirit of what it means to be an American. Over the course of time, building that experimental influence has been a tree by tree attempt and exploration of this aesthetic, pulling on literature, pulling on photography, pulling on my own experiences being in the redwoods, created all of the background to be able to build this. But the one thing, the unifying thing that I wanted to embody with this composition is the concept, the spirituality of being in nature's cathedral. In the creation of this redwood forest, that really started to change and redefine my bonsai approach. I wanted that gateway to the universe, and I really wanted the redwood forest to embody all of the things that I recognize to be true about myself as an American. And this really kicked off that form. Now, in order to do that, the organization of the trunks, these massive pieces of old growth, was the single most important thing I needed to accomplish. Now, I needed depth. I needed smaller trees in the back. I needed smaller trees in the front. I needed differences in height. How do I execute this when you're talking about redwoods being impacted by this coastal environment that snaps their apexes off, that fires rage through periodically and burn out the trunks, that all of these branches are so vertically inclined to grow towards the light that they all form their own individual apices. How do you create that difference of height? How do you utilize that difference of thickness to tell the story of age and success and failure, youth, old? And how do you co-link all of these redwoods to create that ecosystem, that community that drives this forest forward? These were all of the challenges in the creation and the initial establishment of the structure. And one thing I recognized about this is I could load this forest up with tons of tiny, pencil-sized trunks and try to give the impression of a redwood, but I would be moving back towards the traditional form of a bonsai forest, and that's not what the old-growth redwoods look like. And so we went with these large, thick, old, impacted by the logging of the redwoods, these contorted forms, and put them into this singular environment to play off each other, to exist together, and to start to utilize these concepts of design in the forest form, but manipulate them to serve us to really recreate that ecosystem. Now, one of the biggest impressions that struck me when I visited the redwoods and really explored all of the different groves of old growth was the fact that these trees exist on this sloping hillside. Their hierarchy was defined by the winds and defined by the elements, and not necessarily defined by the age of the tree or the size of the tree. Some of the oldest, biggest trees were short, knocked down by weather or charred from fire. Some of the youngest trees were the biggest, reaching high with that vigorous growth. And creating that dynamic in this forest of not necessarily having the thickest tree be the tallest, not necessarily having the thinnest tree be the shortest, was a big thematic of the creation of this forest. Inside of that, utilizing the branching of the redwood to truly give this concept of this skyscraping forest was a big, big piece of the puzzle. Knowing that redwoods grow so vertically, knowing that they form subtrunks readily, and knowing that they also have to have branches that are seeking light, that have that typical downward slope of most of the formal upright bonsai that we see created, mixing and matching those two aesthetics of one vertical and one coming down was a big puzzle that we had to solve in the creation of the redwood forest. Now, before we could go into the design of the redwood forest, we first had to make sure this thing could survive. It was planted in 2012. A structure was built around it that fall so that it could endure the cold winter temperatures of the Pacific Northwest. For 2 years, we carried it through summer and winter, sort of triaging this situation, shade cloth in the heat of the summer, a makeshift greenhouse in the cold of the winter, until we recognized that this ecosystem was in fact going to be feasible. We built a more permanent structure around it, one that would frame the redwood forest, one that would create that cathedral-like feeling, and one that would virtually create a light box so that people viewing it could experience the forest with all of those notions of the sun poking through all of those trunks. And it became a really pivotal part of the creation of the forest. Now, the forest has yet to be wired. It has yet to ever be styled. And the first portion of work that has to take place before we can put wire on this is to go through and systematically select the branches, understand the shapes of these trees. The reason that this redwood forest was planted in 2012 and is just being wired now at the end of 2018 is it took 6 years to learn how to care for it, to learn how to understand the aesthetic of it, and to go through tree by tree the experimentation of how do you execute this vertical form of this iconic species in miniature to truly convey this environment. I think we're finally there, and the beginning of this process is the branch selection, pruning and cleaning to open up the spaces and create those moments where we can give those redwoods the character that they embody. After starting this journey with the initial creation in 2012 of the redwood forest, that winter, I started thinking about all of these other ecosystems that we could represent with bonsai and the creation of these different forms of the forest environment. And the one that was truest to form for me was the ponderosa pines on the granite outcroppings of the Rocky Mountains. As I was growing up as a kid, we would go fishing with my dad and we would pass through these granite outcroppings and you'd see all of these ponderosa pine trunks contorted, crushed by snow, wind, twisted, deadwood. And this informality, this Dr. Seuss-like coexisting, intertwined group of pines out on this sparse granite slab was an image that stuck in my mind and really started to become a festering notion that I needed to create in bonsai form. I had this one very unique tree. It's this beautiful singular trunk with deadwood running up the majority of it, all of the branches leaning to the left, and this small little contorted secondary trunk coming off of the base that really showed the environmental influences that played on this piece of material. And as I looked at this piece of material, I kept thinking, as a standalone tree, it's interesting. But would this be more powerful if the totality of the environment around it were painted by other trees existing in the same landscape, enduring the same environmental influences and really carrying forward that aesthetic? I pulled together 5 ponderosa pines, brought them into the greenhouse, and started to think, how are these 5 ponderosa pines going to coexist with each other? I needed a material to plant them on. A piece of rock that big would be so significantly heavy, so fragile in terms of its mobility, and honestly, I just simply didn't have it. And I started thinking, what else could we use as a material to plant this forest on? We had this beautiful piece of big leaf maple burl slabbed out, and it was a perfect contoured, contorted form that really mimicked the form of granite that was light, was durable, and also paid homage to the local environment of the Pacific Northwest. I started thinking, what if we could plant these trees on this and have the contour of this form really carry forward that notion of the granite? We started to dismantle the root systems of the ponderosa pines, and we started with that primary tree offset, as you would see in a traditional forest display, 1/3 to the right, to give that space on the left and create the asymmetry that followed the leftward moving branches of that dominant trunk. Now, in the process of this, I started to go back to that traditional forest form. I need different thicknesses, different heights, different spacing, foreground, background. I can't have the trunks crossing. I need to have all of these organized, and it just wasn't working. It didn't feel like the granite slabs of the Rockies. And then there was this contorted, zigzagging trunk, the shortest of all of the trunks in the composition that was leaning way too far front in order to make the composition fit all these formal guidelines. And I turned it so that it crossed straight through towards the back of the forest composition, across 2 of the trunks, and all of a sudden it hit. This is what the ponderosas of the Rocky Mountains feel like. This is what the granite slabs, not dictated by aesthetic convention, but created by the natural systems and the natural environmental extremes that act on them. This is what it looks like. Informality, coexisting, intertwining, without rhyme or reason, but simply that struggle for survival. In that move and that deviation, we were able to adhere to so many of the different components of forest creation that give them aesthetic value in the miniature form, but we tapped into that nuance that made that forest specifically representative of that environment, and we created that composition that really touched on that image in my head of when I was 10 years old going fishing in the Rockies, and we're able to build that system and that environment that had influenced me and influenced so many other people living in the backbone of the Rocky Mountains as it cuts through continental North America. This was the beginning of the recognition that inside of forest creation, we do need to be thinking about how do we deviate from fundamental traditional bonsai to truly execute what is special about these places. As I've traveled across the country pursuing bonsai professionally, it's been extremely interesting to see the different bonsai approaches regionally that exist based on the environment and the material that's present. And one of the things that we see when we move east of the Rocky Mountains is the prominence and the rise of the deciduous species as the backbone of bonsai in the eastern United States. I had an amazing opportunity to work on the Connecticut-New York border and consistently visit this environment throughout the seasons over the course of 7 years. And I had this indelible mark etched in my mind as the plane would fly over the eastern forests of the deciduous trees, and seeing that canopy of the trees really level off at this uniform height, and then being transported through those landscapes that created that uniform canopy, that defined boundary between the forest and the sky, driving through that and seeing how this forest was created and the diversity of these small, slender trees, these bigger trees, these medium-sized trees, and all of these trees kind of reaching up, all in generational order, thickness, spacing, depth, all of these things existing, but also this intangible quality of stone being intermixed into that environment. I remember reading history books in school about how difficult it was for the original settlers on the eastern United States to be moving all of the stone out of their fields to be able to farm New York and that area of the United States, and seeing that stone in its presence and its quantity, seeing how the trees adapted to that stone, crawled over that stone, existed between that stone, and how that stone created rooms and spaces and contour. And yet, all of these trees, whether on the stone or not, grew together in these different thicknesses, different heights, different spaces to create that uniform canopy that they all sort of accomplished and achieved based on the environmental conditions that exist to build this one singular solid unit. And this was the birthplace of the beech forest. The beech forest is actually made of European beech, Fagus sylvatica. Because of its small leaf, because of its durability to a drier environment, it made it perfect for this stone composition. And really going back to my trips through those forests as I was going to clients' homes to work on their bonsai collections and paying attention to those smooth bark, beech, and eastern deciduous species, seeing the movement of those branches sort of in harmony together, seeing the smaller trees sparser and struggling inside of the denser forest, fed by their larger counterparts and creating this big cohesive unit, noting the contours, noting the hilliness, noting the rockiness, and still seeing these smooth, flawless lines of these deciduous trees really built this abstract concept that I wanted to convey in this forest composition. Have I spent as much time in that forest? Do I have as much experience? Do I understand the culture that that's fostered and created? Maybe, maybe not, and I would say not, but sometimes the value in the creation of a bonsai concept or miniaturization of nature into the miniature form is in the value of the abstraction of what you thought you observed. And this forest is a true abstraction of a memory that I haven't been able to hold on to. I don't have images of, but it exists very deep in my subconscious, and I think about it often when I'm referring to the eastern United States and the forests that dictate the culture and create the environment that we know of in that region of North America. This forest truly pushed the boundaries and limitation of the ceramic body to hold this kind of weight. It truly pushed the engineering concepts to be able to anchor these stones and anchor these trees to the stone. And it pushed my artistic limit of being able to take that concept, which is very gray and very vague in my mind, and actualize it in a form that does justice to that image of that forest as I was traveling through it and flying above it. The seasonality, the change of colors, the new birth each year with the origination of leaves, and that constant cyclical form of these generational trees working together to create that unified ecosystem is at the epicenter of the beech forest. When we started wiring the redwood forest, the one thing that I was extremely aware of was the challenge of how do I take all of these different forms that are iconically representative of the redwoods and wire and style them to proportionally represent the same scale and size so that they could exist together as a unified ecosystem. Number two, how do I utilize the branching to show the youth, to show the age, to show the vertical, to show the descending, to show the quest for light in this dense forest environment that quantifies and characterizes the redwoods. And the first tree to start any forest composition, really defining and wiring, teasing out that potential, teasing out that stylistic nuance, is the primary tree of the forest. And for this redwood composition, that primary tree is the big, old growth, dead trunk redwood at the top of the root burl. This tree I'd attempted to wire back in 2016, somewhat successfully teasing out the nuances of what it would look like to actually raise most of the branches vertically, iconic of redwood growth habit. But I wasn't able to continue carrying on that wiring because I had not explored enough the balance between vertical and descending branching, and I hadn't explored enough how I take all of those different forms that exist in that singular forest that are also representative of that natural environment of the old growth redwoods, and unify them in proportion, in scale, in height, in thickness, in length, in spacing, to convey all of the different scenarios that the growth on those trees were actually giving me the opportunity to communicate. I'm so happy that I waited 6 years before I ever styled and made the decisions that were made in the creation of this redwood forest from the perspective of wiring, because it gave me time and opportunity to see all of the potential issues that I would encounter in trying to convey and communicate this vertical form. And with the creation of that initial primary powerful tree, it set the tone for the rest of the forest. Now, as I stepped down from that primary tree, the next most slender vertical tree was a big piece to continue to carry that aesthetic forward on and build on the momentum of the stylistic decisions I was making. This tree's canopy was far more narrow than the more prominent, powerful, singular dominant tree of the composition. It needed to be adjusted in terms of the way I handled the canopy and the branches. Instead of being dead vertical, some of them had to move out into sunlight and then up, and this created opportunity to build elbows from which we would form these descending branches. I learned with this second tree that I needed to create the bends at the points where it was most sensical for these branches to be forming and moving into space. And this really allowed me to define the style that I was going to carry into the next 5 trees in the composition. Over the course of that second tree, I saw that that third tree, the smallest tree in the composition and the tree in the foreground that gives us a tremendous amount of perspective, that tree had to embody and carry forward the nuances that made it a little bit more wild than all of the other trees in the composition, and had to unify it to those first 2 trees. That allowed me to take the contorted movement, the spacing between this random formation of these thicker trunks, and really scale down its height, scale down its width, so that it still gave that vertical connotation to the styling, but had its own unique characteristic of a tree that once was much larger and had been beaten down by the elements. As I move around the right side of the composition, these trees on the right side needed to start to reflect that asymmetrical flow, the general composition moving to the right. And in that asymmetrical flow, I started to go back to those fundamental forest concepts. Do I carry the branches longer on the right side so that I create that singular defining branch that we would typically see in traditional formal forest formation? And what I recognized in trying to elongate that right side is that it didn't fit. It broke outside of the boundaries of the scale and proportion that that verticality had been defined by in the first, second, and third tree that I had wired. And so instead of elongating as we would traditionally see in forest design to create that singular composition with the asymmetry based on the branching, I started to reduce the height of these and started to utilize height as that ability to create that asymmetry, but stuck with that very narrow, very slender upright profile of the vertical form to be able to maintain that proportion that gave the whole forest one singular cohesive piece of continuity. Moving all the way to the back of the primary trunk and the highest point in the forest, I knew I needed to create depth. This is where reduction of the height was going to be imperative. In order to reduce the height, though, I had a lot of branches that were giving me a lot of lateral distance and width. And in the back, if I'm showing that background, I'm showing that disappearing skyline, I'm showing that tree that's a quarter mile off and I'm just seeing its silhouette, I actually needed to go farther than the other trees in the composition in terms of reducing their lateral width. I shortened the branches aggressively. I reduced the height aggressively. I really narrowed down the silhouettes of those two trees behind that primary trunk. And in doing so, we got a tremendous amount of depth to grow in terms of the conceptual composition. Moving to the left side, I had intentionally planted this triple trunk redwood to give this sense of a grand tree in the foreground and really start to show that scale that can be conveyed through the forest form and miniaturized creation and conceptualization. I wanted this tree to feel as though it was in your face, that you were standing close to the base of it, that it was really that tree in terms of proximity that was giving you reference to all of the other grandeur that existed behind it. To create that scale and scope, that trunk is more massive than any other tree in the composition. The height of the actual significant trunk line is greater before we transition to vertical multiple apices. And we see inside of that this nuance of design inside of the forest environment at the scale of this redwood that opened up new doors of what can be accomplished if we consider perspective in the formation of a forest on this miniaturized scale. Throughout the wiring of each of these trees, I tapped into different concepts, but one thing remained consistent. Redwoods are inherently vertically oriented. Most of the branches on redwoods grow up, and the smaller, finer, shorter branches grow down and out to seek that sunlight. By using that verticality and that continuity across all of these trees, you're able to tease out these different nuances of the trunks and their position and their purpose inside of this forest ecosystem. Coming back to that trip to the national show in 2012 and all of the things that I was struggling with and sort of wrestling with to figure out in terms of my own bonsai approach, separating from Mr. Kimura and sort of that Japanese construct that I had really been immersed in for 6 years. There was a tree in the national show that stuck out above all other trees as this truly unique and iconic form, and it was Michael Fiducia's bald cypress from southern Florida. And this tree had this big, massive base and this rapid, really tall, long, tapering trunk. And all of the branches existed right at the top of the trunk and flared out in this flat top form. And I saw this tree and I thought, oh my gosh, what is that? That is amazing. And I immediately started looking on my phone at images of what do old growth bald cypress look like. And I saw this flat top form and I started thinking, this is iconic. This is unique. This is completely and totally specific to this species in this region of the United States. One of the most important things that's ever happened to me in my bonsai career was then sort of like a fly on the wall, walking behind the judges as they were judging the national show and listening to the Japanese judge at that 2012 exhibition downgrade that bald cypress for not having your standard downward flowing branches of your traditional formal upright design. I don't know that he knows what a bald cypress looks like. Obviously, I'm thinking, I don't know what a bald cypress looks like. And inside of that, I started recognizing, how can we start to look at bonsai as a representation of nature in miniature if we've never been to see this tree? Or how can we ask people from outside of our culture and our environment to come and to pass their judgment on the forms that are being represented in this medium of bonsai with these trees if they've never seen them and don't know what that tree is supposed to look like? And this, for me, was maybe one of the most major shifts that propelled me in the direction that Mirai has gone in today. From that tree and that iteration of bald cypress that Michael Fiducia created, I all of a sudden became motivated to go down to Florida and see the cypress for myself. Mary Madison was a close friend of mine in high school. She was a mentor to me in college, and I got to go down and experience the cypresses with the Queen of Buttonwoods, as well as one of the most notable figures to collect bald cypress. And I gathered all of the pieces that exist in the bald cypress forest when I was down in Florida on that trip. In piecing those trees together to create this composition, the goal was to build that image of the swamp, that massive buttressing trunk that's submerged for 6 months out of the year in water, that iconic transition of taper up to this flattening out form in the branches, these unique and contorted, differentiated Dr. Seuss-like forms that the trunks take on and actualize that flat top in relation to their neighboring trees around them to form these different layers to the canopy that all embody that same vertical flattening out type of aesthetic. And the crux of this composition was really trying to conform the root systems so that the trees fit together in a way as if they grew that way, as if they were born that way from seed and had continued to work together collaboratively to create that overall impact of the composition. If you note, this composition does follow a lot of those fundamental characteristics of different thicknesses in the trunks, different heights of the trunks, different spacing, and one of the most important pieces of space, that big negative space between the massive trunk, the smallest trunk in the back, and the two trunks off to the right to give you that breathability in a very compact, compressed, swamp-like environment as the bald cypress typically grow. We see the depth in that rear tree, that smallest, least diameter, slender, short, giving us that impression of that distance. And we see that front left twin trunk piece giving us that foreground so that we maintain those different visual fields in the composition. This tree has truly been the bald cypress that I've built my skills around the species on. It's also been a composition that has greatly influenced and grown my passion for the native North American environment. And it continues every year to surprise me and educate me more about how amazing and how beautiful all of these diverse ecosystems can be. One of the most beautiful parts of life is the randomness in which you find yourself in the world for whatever reason. And growing up in Colorado for the first 18 years of my life, I was obviously influenced by the Rocky Mountains and the alpine environment. But in the quest for a horticultural education to better my bonsai practices, I ended up on the central coast of California in San Luis Obispo. Now, while I was in San Luis Obispo, one of the dominant trees on the Pacific coastline is the Monterey cypress. And one of the most interesting aspects of the North American continent is the fact that all of the weather that hits the North American continent and moves across the continent to drop moisture, whether it be on the Sierra Nevadas, on the Rocky Mountains, or moving all the way across to the East Coast, is the movement of the jet stream pulling that weather onto the Pacific coastline. No tree experiences that first onslaught of weather quite as much as the Monterey cypress does along those coastal regions of the Central Coast, up through Monterey, up through Carmel and the Bay Area. When I started working within this idea of these native species, I saw this very unique pygmy cypress that was a dwarf cultivar of cypress native to California and embodied the same characteristics as the Monterey cypress of the Central Coastline. And I started thinking immediately, how can we utilize these trees to really show that first impact of weather? I went down to Point Lobos to examine the last remaining old-growth grove of Monterey cypress, and what I saw and noticed was that all of the Monterey cypress were growing perched on these cliffs and their foliar mass was elongating towards the interior. It was moving towards the eastern portion of the land mass as the wind hit it on the ocean side, compressing it, and continued to trail off across the country, the branches following form. You see the canopy of these Monterey cypress form this singular, unique aerodynamic line as they react and respond to this wind. And that front of weather that slams into the Pacific coastline forms the greater iteration of Monterey cypress shape. In this creation of the pygmy cypress forest, I wanted to create Point Lobos. I wanted to show that onshore flow of weather, and I wanted to show that monoline of the aerodynamics of the wind moving onto the North American continent. As the trees step down from those coastal cliffs onto the actual landmass of North America, we see that wind continue to influence those shapes, but it changes as they're buffered by the stone, the rock, the outcroppings. They're unified as one singular composition. They're bearing the same general characteristics of the wind, but it changes in its degrees depending on how close to the coast you are in that forest environment. The pygmy cypress forest was truly an execution of asymmetry at its most maximum form, with the cantilevered stone leaning to the left and all of the length of the branches contrasting that cantilevered form moving to the right. Over the course of the 6 years that this composition has been in existence, it's been this constant shifting and flux of how far do we push to the right? How long do these branches trail with the wind? How unified can this canopy become in this miniaturized form to still embody these individual trees that exist in this singular collaborative ecosystem and unit weathering these onshore storms? This composition has easily become one of the most iconic pieces that Mirai has created, and with its evolution, so has our understanding of the forest form and all of its iterations and potential possibilities. This tree is, in my mind, one of the most dramatic recreations of a natural environment and one of the most accurate and true to form. Again, we follow that same concept of differing thicknesses, differing heights, differing spaces, differing planes within which we use these trees. But one of the major things that we deviated from in the creation of the pygmy cypress forest that echoed these Monterey cypress was the fact that we changed the form of the trees to show the different coastal environments and the influences of the cliffs, the high points of these spaces and the low points of these spaces, and how those trees' growth changes depending on where their seeds serendipitously fell and took root. This composition embodies a lot of contextual meaning. It embodies a lot of the environmental influences and has become a very powerful representation of what's possible in a bonsai forest composition. When I created the redwood forest in 2012, one of the areas of the redwood forest that I valued the most is the stone that's placed in front of the redwood forest outside of the structure. When I put this stone there, I wanted to create a very definitive place that somebody is supposed to sit when they take in this forest. And the goal of this stone was to take people down to a level where they're forced to look up into the redwoods, as if you were standing in a true blue, full-scale redwood cathedral. As this composition has come to full fruition in its initial wiring and styling, I look back on my journey across the country in 2012. I look back on that confusion that I had trying to find my footing of what it means to do bonsai as Ryan Neal, who was born in the United States, who was created by the environments of the United States, and who exists in these environments with these trees and continues to try and find his way with this medium of bonsai to discuss the impact those environments and those trees have had on me. And sitting down at that stone and looking up at the redwoods, I can honestly say that I have the exact same feeling as I had standing at the base of the redwoods in 2012 when I was first looking at that native forest to try and learn what it would mean to recreate it in miniature. I think so many times we try to quantify what does it mean to do bonsai right. And I think what I've come to over the course of time is it's not about what it means to do bonsai right. There are no rules. There are aesthetic concepts. There are aesthetic ideas that we can utilize to guide our process and continue to find direction when we lose our place or when our experimentations don't necessarily bear fruit. But as this composition has come full circle and you have that feeling that you've struck that perfect balance of taking that grandeur and recreated it in miniature, maybe more than any concept of right, the understanding that we've done bonsai well has started to become my biggest guidepost for knowing when I've actually done my job as a bonsai artist. I'm really excited to see all of these compositions continue to bear fruit, mature, evolve, and further educate me about the North American environment. But the journey for Mirai doesn't stop here. This is an exploration. This is a constantly growing, forever changing, and always out of reach goal of learning more about what it means to be who we are, how we're created, and the impact that the environments and forests of our landscape have had in forming us. I hope over the course of this documentation of Mirai's forests, you guys have not only gained a lot of knowledge about the nuts and bolts and aesthetic factors that allow us to create these beautiful microcosms in miniature, but also hope that you've tapped into those intangible points that really quantify and give character to the environments that define who we are. This medium of bonsai once was thought to be constructed in a box. And over the course of exploration, we're learning that there's literally a limitless amount of potential that we have to convey all of the different points of dialogue and meanings that we explore in our native environment and in life in general. Thank you guys for joining us on this journey. We appreciate your support. Without you, we wouldn't be able to continue this exploration and this idea of pioneering this wonderful way in which we utilize these native pieces of inspiration to create and further expand the boundaries of what we do. Have a great night.